Welcome everybody to TheSquare. I stole James Adams from Brandon, and we're here to talk about adaptive reuse. James, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
Adaptive reuse, real clunky name, real simple idea. Take me through what that is exactly.
Adaptive reuse. That's taking a building that was designed for one use, let's say an office or a warehouse, and renovating it for a new use. Say an apartment complex if it was an office, or an office if it was a warehouse. That's essentially it in a nutshell.
How does that differ, or how is that different from just renovations or just repositioning?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a lot of overlap in those terms, but generally with a renovation, we're taking an existing building and we're simply renovating the interior of the building. We're coming in and putting in a new tenant. It's an office building, a new tenant's coming in. Now it's a different tenant in that office building. Or repositioning typically means something a little bit more. It's still usually always going to be converting a building from its current use, or not converting a building from its current use, still keeping it an office to an office. However, it's a revisioning at a greater scale than perhaps just some of the interior architecture into something wholly different, taking a building and maybe moving the whole front door, the whole entry arrival sequence, how the building is used, how the building's envisioned to meet the goals of today. It's not just flipping it like you might a house and paint a new or put a fresh coat of paint on it. This is actually changing some fundamentals to the building and doing it smartly, meaning effectively, cost effectively, and for the better use of the building. A good example of this is we completed just not that long ago 2401 Cedar Springs. Now, this building was built in the mid-'80s. It was designed very site-specific. It's a flat iron site. And we met with a client who basically was taking this building knowing that a tenant was moving out, the prime tenant who had been in there since the building was built originally, and they were going to have this opportunity to reposition it to something new. And the way the valet drop-off worked, the way circulation in the building worked, the type of amenities they wanted on the ground floor, through our analysis and design exploration, we realized that they really weren't the best use of that building. So in that case, we took that building and we relocated the drop-off rather than being on the tip of the flat iron corner of the building, which created circulation issues for pedestrians walking through the neighborhood. And again, it was built at a time when there wasn't as much of a push or desire for that pedestrian experience. We wanted to bring that back. And the neighborhood was transitioning into something that would allow for that better and have connectivity at urban fabric. So we doubled down on that and pushed to infill the corner of that ground floor of that building where the drop-off was, and instead bring the drop-off parallel to the site and allow for a better circulation on site. So a lot of studies went into that. We partially reskinned the building. We took off the cladding that was on there and wanted to use a more contemporary building material. We also changed the proportions. There was a very large cupola on that building, and it was overscaled. It was from a period of time of postmodern architecture that was very fashionable in the 80s when it was done, and it was out of style. So some of that's a little bit more cosmetic, but it was trying to make it feel more contemporaneous to Class A offices that are being built ground up today.
More often than not, it's like buildings from the 70s and 80s get reskinned a lot more than older buildings. Is that just because of a strong design aesthetic or what?
I think, well, for a couple of reasons. One, I think that's a great question. And it does happen for all different eras of buildings, but buildings that were built in the turn of the last century through the 20s and 30s are mostly not what we call a modern architecture, especially not the mid-century modern or machines of living, machines of office that came along later with the advent of newer technology. Curtain wall, uses of extruded aluminum, things that came about really in the 40s and 50s post-war, was the advent of the creation of a lot of these skin systems. And these early versions of these were not necessarily high performance. They leaked air. They allowed the thermal transfer of just heat or cold inside or out. And because of that low performance, when it came time to reposition or renovate these buildings with newer technology, a lot of these it's made sense to just remove the cladding altogether. And it's still the same method of construction, but the quality of the products we're using today is so much more high performance. The glazing obviously is one of the most obvious ones. We have a lot better glass. We have insulated glass. When we're looking at double insulated glass, now triple insulated glass. There are a lot of new products out there, but that's kind of a quick way to answer that kind of question is there just better technology. And those older buildings, because prior to a lot of the work we saw in the kind of World War II era, the exterior walls were load bearing, heavy brick walls. And so recladding those is really just an additive effort, while a more modern building where the skin is hung on the facade, like a curtain wall building, it's much easier to take that off and remove it. There's less intrinsic value in the building. And I mention that because it's a good segue. The real value proposition to begin with in using an existing building is the intrinsic value of the existing structure. Now that may be the obvious, which is simply you have a concrete or steel or whatever, you have a frame, you have a building already there. So your ability to deliver to market may be a lot quicker. So meaning you might spend less money, you might spend more money depending on what you do, but either way, you're more likely to have that building turned over and be a revenue source a lot faster. And for a lot of our clients, that speed to market is very critical. Let's say we're in a multifamily condition, we might want to be the first building turned over with units available in a particular neighborhood. If we come in third or fourth, it may already be saturated. It may take longer for absorption of those apartments, and so being first to the neighborhood to deliver can make a big difference. But also, there's also aesthetic value to some of these buildings, especially some of the buildings we talked about that are of an earlier character, that heavy brick. We see a lot of that here in the West End. We see it in a lot of cities we work in. There's intrinsic emotional value and branding value in an older building. One, it's already been there a while. Everyone's aware of it, probably.
Yeah, they're used to
it. But there's a nostalgia to it, too. There's a sense of a harkening back to something, maybe something that's got more of a grander memory than it may or may not have been. But that also is because often we tend to demolish buildings over time. And so the stock of buildings from any particular era begins to dwindle. So whether a building was the best building of its time,
right,
maybe the only building left, and so we value it for that reason. And we deal with that a lot in our preservation work. So
you've got a client that's got a building, and they're at the crossroads of deciding whether we go do we use what we got and make it work and either reposition or do we need to there, or I guess let's say reposition in this case, or we do a completely new build. Let's go to Frisco.
Build
some glass.
Yeah.
Talk me through just kind of what are the kind of big design choices in the design tree that you're going to kind of walk them through. You're going to say, what's the A or B in that aspect, and they're using that problem.
Well, one step will be if we start with the thinking that they're going to keep the building, or they're going to use a building that's existing. They're looking at the value of the building and what they're going to spend on that building, and that's that developed site. It's probably going to cost more. Not necessarily, but usually that's going to be in a more urban area, a more dense area. It's already been developed. It's not going to be an existing building just sitting out in the middle of a green field surrounding site. So there's value in the location often to begin with. Obviously, there's usually some value in the structure itself, the building itself. But we have to have our clients understand or communicate what their budget is to work on this building. So there's a little back and forth on that. Often they may have a much more sophisticated, I want to say the word ruthless, but a clear understanding of what they want, what they have to work with budget-wise. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it depends. But they're looking at a price point from a pro forma of what they can charge and rent and what it's going to cost them to build and what the cost of the structure to buy the property is. And that kind of, outputs to them what they can afford to spend on it. If we know that, then we can begin to work on a strategy to test fit the building and understand what it will take to adapt the building to fit their needs. So that can come at from a bunch of different ways of how you approach that. But ultimately what we'll do is we'll be given a site for a client, or a prospective client, say, hey, we're looking at this building. What can we do with it? We think we want to make it into X, an apartment complex. So then our team can come in and do a quick test fit, study the depth of the building, study how light is, what kind of views and what kind of daylighting you get in the building. Often a lot of older buildings have perhaps programmatically their architecture is not what is optimal for today. A good example of that strictly is some of these older office buildings are very large, deep footprints. So getting light into a space, into the core of the building can be very difficult.
When you say, but for today, I mean, I guess how has that changed over the years? Because I would imagine if it's dark and dreary, and you say deep, like if it's dark and dreary, let's say the 1950s, to now, it's like, well, obviously, I think maybe someone in that space would have always wanted that. I guess why is it that way?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
There are trends in what rents a building.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's two parts to that. One is if it's a straight office to office, it may have had a deeper pool. It may have had more offices, like hard-walled offices in the building. It may have just had less natural light. That's not always the case. There are beautiful examples of well-lit buildings, as long as we've been building office buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But probably a better case for that is actually, the adaptive reuse. What may have worked as an office building with a very deep floor plate may not work for an apartment complex. If you're trying to build a corridor inside to access these apartments, and you want to align this warehouse building or office building from a different era with those units, they may end up being very deep apartments, which means they're going to be very narrow apartments, just because we can't have say a 2,000 or 4,000 square foot one-bedroom apartment. It needs to be falling in more of a market-ready 700 to maybe 900 square feet. So if you know it's got to be already 45, 50 feet deep, as opposed to more of a market-ready 32, 30 feet deep, depending, then you're going to have a narrower unit, which means you've got to find a way to successfully put bedrooms towards the window exterior, or create open loft-style units where the bedroom's in the front of the unit, meaning the corridor side, the darker part of the unit, light is still able to get back there from the living and kitchen areas. So that can be a real challenge. And Corgan has done hundreds of units in these conversion type projects starting in the mid-90s. So that could be a real challenge to figure that out. But again, it goes back to just trends, like an office. What are people looking for? One of the big trends that our commercial interiors team has continued to, trend's the wrong word. One of the practices, or what we're seeing more and more over the last 15 years, is the importance of the role of the HR department in the selection of a new facility's location, or if it's an existing building or a design, because retention is so important. Recruiting is so important to businesses today that they need to create a space that works for their realized and potential employees. And so things like daylighting, again, quality, access to amenities, location plays into that. And so that's become hyper sensitive decision process post-pandemic, and with the return to the workplace and the leveling of that market of what do tenants want, what do employees want in an office, what makes it special. And we see that that's part of a larger trend, I think, of a search for authenticity that we see in architecture as a whole. Something my team talks about a lot is, and it can be related to sort of a boutique experience, a more custom experience, a sense of place.
This is a preservation question, which is that you talk about people maybe having the rose-tinted glasses or having the nostalgia for a space. In the challenge of preserving that space but not removing all of the character from it, talk to me about that challenge and how you kind of walk that tightrope.
Oh, it's a great challenge. So we're working on a great project right now, just across the street from our headquarters. It's actually the building that used to house our headquarters for well over 20 years, part of the John Deere warehouse complex at 501 Elm Street. And that's obviously a very sensitive building in the sense that it's on one of the oldest sites of the establishment of kind of, Western society in Dallas, in the region. And it's also the site of the intersection of where the assassination of JFK occurred, next to the school book depository. So that building has a presence. It is, it's a 100-year-old building. And in that case, we were taking that building and converting it to apartment complex right now, currently. And so that project is pursuing historic tax credits. Those are provided by the National Park Service and by the Texas Historic Commission. And those tax credits are very valuable to a project. However, there's a multi-phase administrative process and inspection process by a third party to qualify that a project will meet the goals and the standards for a renovation project. And so we get into these topics about what are the intrinsic values of this building. Now, the first part of that process is to identify just that, to define the building and what makes it special. Why are we celebrating this building? What makes it of value? Not just that it's old. It has to be more to the story than that. So then the part two, which is when you present your design to the National Park Service about what you intend to do to modify the building, the part one that describes what's valuable about the building has to be taken into account. If you know there are certain design features that are critical to the integrity of the history of that building, you need to maintain those. Sometimes that involves a complete reconstruction if they've been demolished, and recreate authentically the details that were lost if they have been lost, or just repairing them. And there are limited ways you can modify a building, of course. That there are modern needs for, say, an elevator. The building didn't have one originally, or proper egress is one. Often a lot of these buildings fell under a timeline when
You just burn inside.
well, no. But rather, you might have had one single stairwell inside the building, and you had one that was a fire escape.
Right.
And obviously, we've moved away from fire escapes in almost all uses nowadays. But you had to find a way to get that second means of egress that the code would require for a building of this type, for a high-rise. So adding those elements to the building, if they can be done internal to the structure, great. But again, some of these buildings will have massive concrete slabs or heavy floors or heavy brick enclosures and may not lend themselves to that. So it can be a challenge to do that. And just a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, we finished the adaptive reuse or partial adaptive reuse of the Texas Theater. So the Texas Theater, again, this ties us back, Dallas, to JFK. So this is where Lee Harvey Oswald was apprehended after also allegedly, technically it's the proper term, shooting Officer Tippit on his escape after assassinating JFK. And that theater is a historical landmark for two different reasons, both for its relation to the assassination of Kennedy, but also to the time period of the golden era of a film and when that theater was constructed. It was the first theater with air conditioning in Dallas. It had an atmospheric sky. It was an integral building. And so when that building was renovated in the 60s after JFK's assassination, they went to great lengths to reface the building and change the look and feel inside and out. And so when we were brought in to add a second theater to that facility by taking the existing mezzanine balcony and converting it to a second screen, and adding in modern amenities such as accessibility, which technically, because of its historic stature, we were not required to make it accessible, but it was very important to the client that we did have an accessible path. And we love that of the client who sees the value of that for equity for everyone. But that was a challenge to itself. How do you add an elevator? How do you put another stair in? How do you make these modifications to an existing building? And I won't belabor all the details of that, but we worked through it with the client, and we were able to satisfy all parties, including the National Park Services as well, to find an abandoned shaft and basically add an elevator into that in the facility. So these are the kind of challenges that do come up. In that case, the building had so much value due to the history and the nostalgia of the building. It's an easy win for adaptive reuse. But you take a mid-century building. I'll take another example. Would be 1200 Main Street, again in Dallas, down the street from us. It was converted in 2008. It's an older project, but it's just a good example that came to mind of a early international style curtain wall, all brown glass, brown curtain wall building into an apartment complex. And so that building was not preserved, it was not protected. The intrinsic value was simply, now you've got a 26-story existing building right here in downtown, ready to go. All we got to do is adapt it, adjust it to include amenities and put apartments in it. But that had its own challenges still. In that case, we had to actually construct a new parking structure adjacent to the building and tie that into the building, and also provide for a new pool and amenities on top of this garage. We needed more parking for the residents that were going to move into this building. And it was wildly successful. It was a great project. It actually was a condominium project, work that we no longer pursue condominium for sale projects, but we did in this case at the time period, and it was very successful. So
it seems like it's a lot of existing offices moving to residential and maybe more, I don't want to say industrial to office. Is there like a clear chain where it's like we adaptively reused this warehouse to an office, and then that office was reused into like, is that just the life cycle of a building nowadays, or what?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that's a bit anecdotal because there are a lot of good examples, but it just depends on what the use of the building is for. So a lot of those, probably the layman's answer to that is that yes, the leap of adapting a warehouse to an office is an easier leap than a warehouse to a residence. But we have done those as well. It just depends on the era and time of the warehouse. Now we haven't done any conversions of very contemporary warehouses or more
When you say warehouse, I think of an Amazon fulfillment center.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't mind living in one of those, but not for forever.
Yes.
Right? I mean, the moving walkway would be nice and the robots would be cool, but the lack of natural light might start to eat at me.
That's a big part of it. We haven't found a use for those projects. And I think that goes back to the conversation about following the trends of where we're headed in a boutique, a more authentic market, is that if you're going to create office space, it better be good. If you want people to come to work, it's got to meet the needs that people really want. Where's the value of that over just having a video call or coming in once a week to something else? So we're seeing a struggle with the value office market. There's a place for, and when I say value office, I'm talking about buildings that are offices that are constructed of the most efficient means possible. So often this is going to be a concrete tilt-up wall, meaning it's a cast concrete building on the ground. The walls are lifted in place, has a steel frame inside. There are limits to the openings and to the articulations on the building. It's a very budget-friendly office. And it can do amazing things with that because, for example, our commercial interiors team can come in and create some pretty amazing things on the inside of the building. Rather, it's more about the location and, again, an intrinsic value of the architecture itself. If it's just a bare bones office building on the outside, like a warehouse-esque office building, it may not draw the interest of the users that we're looking for. Not always the case, but that is a factor in all of this, I think. And so converting from one of these type of warehouse buildings to apartments is even a harder sell. And a lot of that also goes to how the building is constructed. What can you do with it? When the concrete exterior walls in a tilt-up building are constructed, the openings are limited, and that may not be conducive to the kind of windows you want in an apartment. At the end of the day, if you're looking out of an apartment window and it's this big, large storefront window, or it's even smaller, let's say, it may not give you the same sense of wonder or desire to be in that building. Which it's funny because you think back to the buildings from 100 years earlier with large steel casement windows that may not have been in vogue for living in 40 years ago. Right. 50 years ago, at least not in this market. Maybe you saw that in Tribeca or something like that, in Soho in New York, but we didn't see it here. And now there's enough nostalgia and appreciation for that. Over the last 25 years, we've converted those types of buildings into housing here, and the Future Lofts in Deep Ellum is a good example of that.
It's like, when you're adapting those certain typologies, one to the other, you always know when it's not working. Like you go, I'm going to use my own experience because I can't tell you how many stores I've been into that were like once a residential home that they've we're going to be an outdoor store now, or we're a children's clothing store, and they're building it around this home that was maybe built in the, let's say, 10s, 20s,
a little
30s,
bungalow
40s,
or something like that, yeah.
And it's just, this is not working. Yeah. This is not, I'm not comfortable. I'm not able to shop comfortably. Yeah. I know the people that I'm sliding next to are not comfortable. And so, that I know that's probably a huge risk in trying to figure out kind of what those spaces work best and which ones could be, adapted the easiest.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example of another project, and I'm trying to get too into the weeds on these, but we had the opportunity a while back to work with the Family Place, which is essentially it's a domestic violence shelter and services and counseling facility or organization based here in Dallas. And they had an opportunity working with Parkland Hospital to acquire a warehouse building nearby that had been at one point a dry cleaning facility. So it had some chemical issues. It had some issues for remediation we had to take care of. But in that case, it was a very large warehouse building, and we needed to convert it to temporary housing, office space, and counseling rooms. And what we ended up doing with that building is we actually studied it in depth and plan, realized our best solution was to actually demolish part of the building, construct a new building that had of smaller dimensions and spaced that building away from the warehouse that remained. That created a courtyard in between the two buildings that we then surrounded with enclosures and corridor spaces that made it a safe courtyard in the middle of the building. That gave a garden for reflection after counseling, and it gave a space for people that were have escaped domestic violence while they were in this temporary shelter, a place to be outdoors but still to feel safe. Because these are people that are in a place of extreme vulnerability and did not have a safe place. It was just a miracle they were able to get to this facility. Right. But what that allowed us to do was, one, it made the building smaller, the existing building, so we had more natural daylight. It also allowed us to custom tailor a part of the redevelopment by creating an all-new building for a portion of it that would meet the needs really of those residences and to do it cost effectively. So it ended up being a great project. And it was a combination of new construction and repositioning of the existing building. But it took our team time to go through that analysis with the client and say, look, it actually is going to be better for your program to demolish part of the building you already have and create a whole new one. And that was, at first blush, that can be a hard sell. Like, we already have a building. Why can't we just use it as it is? And it's like, well, here's a middle ground, how you can get something better out of both. And that was a good success story.
So you talked about doing, analysis on the building. How does the sustainability aspect, as far as using newer building materials, affect the overall construction, or versus old versus new, and be able to incorporate maybe some of those newer building materials or insulation efforts or whatever it may be? Like, how do you sell that where it's like, look, this may cost more, but in the end, it's going to save you money? How does that conversation usually work with a client?
It's a good question. So I think oftentimes we've seen a range from our clients of understanding about what the impacts are. Now, from a code perspective, generally renovations are largely exempt from meeting standardized International Building Code, ASHRAE standards on what the envelope needs to be to make the building sustainable. And there's so many parts to sustainability, right? The envelope is just one of them, but it can be a big one. But nonetheless, it was an opportunity for us to explore that conversation with the client on what they're willing to do and what best serves the needs of their prospective tenants or end users in the building. Some of these buildings are really well set up inherently for good insulation. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them aren't at all. We have to evaluate that. And so we've gone back and we have replaced all the windows in buildings before. We've had to create new thermal breaks for areas where heat transfer was occurring on the exterior facade, a change of one material to the other. I mean, old early international style modernist buildings, all glazed buildings. Think about every tower in Chicago, basically starting in the 50s, early 60s, had a skin system that may have been very porous.
Right.
Great new technology, but it really wasn't. We really hadn't mastered it as a society yet, and so those kind of buildings often have major issues with leaking of air, if you will, or infiltration and a non-continuous insulation. And that can be a challenge. I think it's to evaluate what you can do on those facades. And so sometimes you can't do anything about it because it's cost prohibitive to completely reclad a building. It may be because a building of an international style is now actually eligible and is on the National Register and is protected. And so those kind of buildings too, we can't take off the facade of a Mies van der Rohe building in Chicago if that's part of the intrinsic value of the building. Same goes for even a brick building here in the West End in Dallas, Texas. We have to approach those case by case. But on the flip side, these buildings, because we're not tearing the whole building down, there is an enormous amount of waste we avoid that goes through the creation of a structural skin of a building and putting the facade up. All of that has just been avoided. You've just recycled the building. And that's huge in telling that story. Plus, a lot of these buildings, because again, these are urban buildings, and we're talking largely today about buildings here in in Texas and in Dallas, and we talked about some other places as well, but they're all pretty much U.S. based. And you think about a large part of the world, the bulk of all their buildings are, a very big bulk of their buildings are all repositionings or renovations of older buildings. Sometimes buildings that are hundreds of years old.
Because they have to be, because there's no more room.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But even here, I think as our infrastructure ages, as our inventory of architecture ages, even in a young city like Dallas that only dates back, 160 years or something like that, at least from what I call Western developed, the way we see our city today. That the infill that's occurred over time, the density that's gained, the quality of the buildings means more and more we're going to keep reusing these older buildings and finding ways to make the most of them. And so because of that, these are buildings that are in our city centers. They're going back to the sustainability point of this, is that they are accessible by mass transit or by multiple means of getting there. You can walk to the building perhaps. And so that also is taking away from the carbon footprint of the life cycle of these buildings as well. So they're all factors in this, but you kind of have to go with that initial analysis, the due diligence that we'll go through in the beginning of the project to understand what's possible.
I mean, is asbestos still a thing? Does that sneak up every once in a while?
So asbestos, while the vast majority of projects do not have asbestos that are being built today, asbestos is still being mined and used throughout the world, and it can end up in projects. And so when we're doing a renovation of a project, regardless of what it was done, we still have to follow the requirements to have a initial ESA or phase one environmental testing completed, which is mostly a visual test to come in by a third party who is licensed to inspect the space and say, hey, these areas may or may not be problematic. And if they are, it may require a deeper dive in a phase two to actually perhaps do a partial demolition, remove some ceiling tiles or take out some insulation and have it tested to see if it is an issue for asbestos. And that's been a problem before. There have been buildings that were intended to be demolished. And unfortunately, the asbestos that was in the building was too prohibitive to demolish the building by traditional means. So you either take the building apart brick by brick, or you just remove and remediate the asbestos or other materials that are hazardous, lead, things like that. Limit it to that scope and keep the building. I've seen this happen before, and then you work around it. So it's definitely still an issue. For example, even when Corgan at our world headquarters here in Dallas decided to expand our building and work with a developer at the time to construct an addition, create the luminary that's next door. Once we began excavating the site next door and we uncovered oil, we found
not just oil, barrels of oil,
just remnants from a different period of time, and this material all had to be properly remediated and removed, and that led to a lot of testing and a lot of studies in order to do that. And it was one of those things we had no records to know, really, so to speak. We had some very limited, records, but this dated back to the 1880s.
Yeah, no one's going to put hidden barrels of oil that I was supposed to dispose of properly, right? Register that with the county, right?
Exactly. So you find those things, and you have to remediate them and work around them. So that can be an issue.
All right, so this is like a two-parter technology question. So one is, how does technology, when you're doing a new build, obviously so much of what we focus on is visualizing the new space, right? Through fly-throughs or using VR. When you've got an existing space, is it easier for the client to maybe grasp onto some of those design concepts when they can be in a space, or is it harder because they're now fighting something that's physically present?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We see a bit of both, of course, but I think that it's much more common to have the second one. Sometimes people don't have the vision for what a building can become at all, and a repositioning can be very emotionally dramatic. It can really move people the way you interject new ideas. The obvious one that goes to my mind, it's obvious, is you've got a brick building and you come in and put some type of glass vestibule of a very different architectural style, very contemporary. And it sets the contrast alone can really evoke certain emotions from people, hopefully, if it's done well, for the better. Of what this juxtaposition of materials can mean. But a lot of clients can't see that up front. And it does take the ability for us to say, hey, I know you see this building as a as something in the rough, but there is a gem in there, and we can polish it and find that for you, and we can do it cheaper than if you started from scratch. I think we've built up at Corgan a big enough portfolio where we have a lot of those case studies. I mean, a great example of that, again, this is an older project, but it's one that's very memorable, is the old Bank One Tower in downtown Fort Worth. And in 2000, that was hit by a tornado.
Mm-hmm.
And it was devastating to the building and blew out a ton of glass and basically made the building completely unusable. And ultimately, that building was completely reskinned by our team and converted to apartments. And now it's a beautiful part of the skyline. But it sat there as an empty building for so long. And we had a client who was fantastic about understanding the potential of this. And it made for a great project. But it was a complete change to that building. The way that building initially met the ground as a tower was as the tower came down to the ground, the exterior columns canted out at like a 45-degree angle. And it created this very odd entry sequence where the ground plane didn't really exist. It was more of this sloping building. And it was dramatic for the time period it was constructed. But we were able to come back and create a multi-story urban, vertical urban edge and create all this new space on a low podium that created restaurants and amenities for the building. And you still, when you entered the building, you went through this colonnade, this angled colonnade, but you didn't really see it or experience it the way it used to impact the urban fabric of downtown. And so it was a catalyst project for the neighborhood. And we had a client who understood that.
That brings up a question. I'll save my second technology question. When you talk about, maybe there's, I think the spur of a lot of this is the changes in zoning, because even for that Bank One, like obviously that was in some sort of financial district or some sort of area where it's not necessarily residential. So how does you basically, I know we probably don't want people thinking like I'm living in like an old bank. So like, what's the challenge there of like the zoning and making sure that you're having the right kind of space in the right area and not just fitting it because the space makes sense or it's available?
Well, thankfully, and as someone talked about earlier, is that a lot of these do occur in urban centers. Mm-hmm. And so typically the zoning in the urban centers is going to be the most flexible. Okay. It basically will allow for any use outside of maybe a heavy industrial, perhaps, manufacturing. So that's why you get this texture in a city. And what's great is that, again, I'm going to use Dallas or any Sunbelt city. These are downtowns that were not built for living. Mm-hmm. Now, originally they may have been in homes there at one time, but for all intents and purposes, as those cities developed, especially as Dallas did, residences were mostly gone by the 60s in the downtown core. And offices were coming in, and these are single-use buildings, a lot of them were. Some may have had, meaning they may have been only an office with no other amenity in the building. That became more and more prevalent in the 70s and 80s. But when you go back and revisit these buildings, they're and you're converting them to apartments, per se. They're creating more texture, more fabric in a city, where suddenly you have businesses, you have apartments, you have offices, and that creates a much more mature neighborhood. But even those things have incompatibilities of not just zoning by law, but just by use. I mean, the practicality of depending on what you have a bunch of clubs that are opening at night next to a residential neighborhood you're trying to reposition from what used to be an office area. Like, that's just the growing pains of an urban city. And the success of any city is its ability to be agile, unlike our firm, and to adjust. Cities have to be able to overcome the market changes, the businesses that are in their city, what works, what doesn't work. And so we're seeing that next level in Dallas, and we've seen a lot of cities where it is becoming a really robust residential neighborhood. I mean, 20 years ago, we had about 400 residents living in downtown Dallas, inside the highway loop, over the 1,000-acre site that really makes downtown. Today in downtown, we probably have closer to 10,000 immediately in there, and peripherally right around the downtown loop, still within walking distance, we're pushing 20 to 30,000. It's just dramatic change. So you have all of these people living in the neighborhood. It makes for a more walkable, safer, 24-hour community than it used to be. And that can actually drive some businesses that want to run office space or have, operate office space in the city, a more attractive proposition, because now they think, hey, we could have employees actually working down here or living down here and working down here. So those kind of changes are or could be opportunistic, depending on who the tenant is for the building. So AT&T did that. And AT&T came down and built the Discovery Center
Yeah.
down here. They really reinvested in the neighborhood and adapted a lot of existing buildings to create the campus.
But definitely in so much as like when you're working from those single use buildings, having to build out those amenities and finding the space for all those where it's not just, not just finding places for people to live, but like to really dwell and thrive has got to be like an insane challenge.
A very big challenge. I mean, we have Corgan's had the fortune many times over the years to work on what's been known as the Bank of America Plaza Tower, right? And that bank building was originally constructed, late 80s. It's a massive building. I think it's like 2.1 million square feet, and it's a beautiful design. JPJ Architects did this, and the ground floor has strictly been the office. There has been a mixed use component, but that's been in the concourse underground as part of the underground tunnel system that's largely been vacated completely.
Yep.
And for the better, but the amenities that are still in that basement still work well for that tower, but they're just controlled primarily to that tower and a few buildings nearby that are adjacent to it. But the ground floor is void of a pedestrian experience. It's made to have a sense of grandeur. Yes, you're at the biggest building in downtown. Be wowed by that, and that may be appropriate for it. But as part of a larger urban fabric, those mixed uses don't exist at the ground floor, and that is an issue the building, a challenge the building has, and the owners of the building have been forced to find ways to address. So, I mean, these are the kind of things you have to kind of explore. It kind of depend on a case by case basis.
This is a very Dallas centric hot sports opinion that I'm about to, or that I'm going to request from you.
Okay.
You said the removing of the underground tunnels for the better. What is your take on that and why?
Well, I think the issue is that we have a lot more density, pedestrian density, and just more people walking around downtown. But even still, and especially 10, 20 years ago, that tunnel system pulled the limited stock of pedestrians walking on the street level down underground. And so it left our streets bare. And even though we have a lot more density and more people walking around, driving all those things underground, I would hope it'd be apparent to a lot of people it's not the best space health-wise to be working all day downtown, let's say, underground in a tunnel with no natural light, perhaps. And it just took away from our streetscape. And it allowed a lot of these buildings to be developed that had no ground floor experience other than a lobby. And that's detrimental to the overall urban fabric. It just took away from all of that.
So what do we do? What do we do with that space? How do we adaptively
You close the corridors off that connect these buildings, and you use that space for parking or for storage or for something else. But please don't put people down
Tennis
there.
courts,
whatever you can fit in
pickleball
them.
courts.
Whatever you can fit in them, if you can get those things down in there. And that's the challenge we have as architects, I think, and as designers, is to take these kind of buildings and start finding the next innovative solution. What's next? I mean, one of the things we've studied a lot, I mentioned the building, the Family Place project where we did a partial demolition. Well, we're trying to future-proof a lot of buildings now as well, where let's say we construct a new parking structure. Well, how can we set that building up for success in a future where we may not need that much parking or not need it downtown? We don't know. We don't know where the trend's going to go. We can try to play futurists and see what's going to happen. But what you can do is just future-proof it by creating a plan that says, hey, you know what? We're going to come back later in another future, and we're going to remove the ramps and open those areas up for more natural daylight. And then we're going to use the areas we parked before, but we're going to make sure those areas have a high enough floor-to-floor clearance that it could be converted to an apartment or a house later. Or in the case of like the Dallas County parking structure, that's just a few blocks away from here near the convention center.
Which we did an episode on that I will link below.
1,200 cars roughly in that garage, but we planned that structure to carry a future addition, a tower above.
Right.
So yes, it may be primarily a parking structure today. Now it does have retail opportunities on all four corners. We really focused on that. But we can go back and add a 15-story tower on top. So that's part of that future proofing is that you may not get rid of the garage, you may convert the garage, but what else can you do with the site? And so I think as thought leaders, we've been trying to really evaluate that and help our clients think long-term for the benefit of the building.
When you're taking an older space, and I know we struggled, here with our headquarters here, when you don't have access to maybe the historic plans and you don't have all the information you need, I guess, what technology, what processes are you using to get that information to like have a just starting geometry to work off of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can tell you, having spent so the first couple of years of my career at Corgan, I cut my teeth doing adaptive reuse, converting buildings from the 20s into multifamily projects, old office buildings. It was a great way to learn. Did a lot of field verification, had to be out on the site and understand these buildings and understand how they were built. And it takes a while to really appreciate the approach that architects at that time period, how they were designing based on the construction methods employed. So a really simple example of this, which seems very obvious once I state it, but it wasn't always clear to us at the time when we were evaluating these buildings, is that concrete columns on a building may be getting smaller and smaller as you work up the tower. They may not be centric, meaning the center of the column may not be the same on every floor. And so you start getting these odd dimensions. And there's just construction in the field. And you're trying to figure out what was the intent of the design. Because when we're trying to document that, our goal is to give as accurate as possible existing conditions to our design team and to the contractor of what's there to begin with. Because the better those drawings are, then the better they are likely to fulfill the design intent that we put in our drawings. If the conditions are wildly different, like, hey, Mr. Architect, this column was actually 2 feet over.
You're doing the same thing that they were doing.
Yeah, exactly.
50 years ago, 60 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the great things that's come about is that, a lot of those buildings actually have good archives, and we have to just find them. I remember when we were working on one building, the Neil P. Anderson, it's now called the Neil P., a condo project. Again, this project was done a long time ago, beginning of my career. We spent a solid week or two just trying to evaluate and develop plans of the existing conditions. But lo and behold, one of our other architects was able to contact the University of Texas in Austin and find in their archives the original drawings. So it was kind of a Hail Mary approach that we'd already thought we'd exhausted all those efforts. Didn't think we'd find them there in Austin, but sure enough we did. Wyatt C. Hedrick was the architect who had completed those plans, and his archives were available. And that saved us a lot of time. But today, there's so much amazing 3D photo technology, camera technology that can actually scan these spaces and create photographic recreations digitally for us to work off of that give us an amazing amount of accuracy. And we started with that with LiDAR technology, where it was just giving us a point cloud of data points of the distances from various existing structures. Think of it like a 3D X-ray, right? Moving into this photographic technology, which not only gives us the same kind of point cloud that the older technology gave us, but actually gives us a real world imagery of it. I remember a project we worked on a while back, the Bedford Springs Hotel, a place that was the summer home of 2 presidents, as a renovation project that dated back to the late 1700s up in Pennsylvania near Bear Run, near where Falling Water, which I think a lot of people may be aware of, Falling Water, the home by Frank Lloyd Wright, the Coffin residence. That facility, we couldn't just jump on a plane every week and verify things. So at that time, the Media Lab here at Corgan actually was using technology to create 360 photographs or 180 photographs and give us as much documentation as possible, sending their team out there so that we could have all that information at our fingertips. So same kind of thing. That was just an early version of it. Today, it's great. We can send a team out. We have all the technology. We can scan these buildings in. We have everything we need then to analyze and create documents from that.
What do you personally get out of these projects?
That's a good question. I think, when I was in kindergarten, one of my favorite exercises was where, as a creativity test, our teacher would draw a random doodle on a sheet of paper, and we were assigned with completing the doodle into something, a drawing, and then writing a story about it at a kindergarten level, right? But I was always intrigued by the challenge of working with something already existing and bring a new story to it, bringing it to life. I mean, you think about cities. The best cities in the world are cities that are built up against mountains or rivers. They have the challenge of an existing condition, and they work with it to complement it. And I think that the opportunity to take something existing, maintain its integrity, the vision of the people who a long time ago envisioned this building and developed it, designed it, constructed it, and maintain and preserve as much of that as possible while bringing a new life and new solutions to that challenge is just one of the greatest experiences, because it's very easy to have a clean slate. Say, hey, here's a field. Let's build a building on it. We can do whatever we want. Sky's the limit. There are challenges to that. You have to have an idea of what you want to do. But I love the idea if there's already a problem there. It's already not a problem. There's already a challenge there. There's already existing opportunity in this existing building. I love that. I want to finish the doodle.
So what topologies has Corgan not done yet that you're kind of jumping at the
It's a great question.
bit to get after?
So my friends in the data center sector would probably not think I would say this, but we have dabbled with the conversion of buildings into data centers a lot. And we have some success stories on that have actually gone ahead and pulled the trigger and done that work. But we have several that we've been on the cusp of doing. And there are a lot of great older building types, not necessarily just warehouse buildings, but there are urban infill buildings, urban buildings existing, maybe multi-story, that we have explored the idea to convert to data centers. And I think it's a great idea. If we have let's say it's an old phone company building with heavily reinforced floors, carry a lot of weight, or an open pathways to bring cooling air into a space, or to access equipment, or that are just structurally have an integrity that allows for a safer, our ability to better protect the equipment inside the building. These are great opportunities. They're also on the urban grid. Perhaps they have multiple means of, in simple terms, getting electricity to the building.
Redundancy. And
Exactly. Exactly. Some of those urban buildings allow that. So I'd love to see some of these kind of buildings converted to data centers rather than just maybe constructing an all-new building out in a field somewhere. Put it right in the middle of the city. Put it somewhere right there, blending in with everything else. That's a great opportunity for us to, especially with newer technology we're using today, to do higher performance buildings. I'd love to see that happening a lot more. It's probably a big one for me.
All right. Well, we'll be on the lookout for that. James, thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on The Square.